Now that we have the bullet from the last video, we're going to work on giving points when the bullet collides with the enemy. So we're going to go down into our functions section. We don't need any new images for this part. And below the bullet fire or fire bullet function, I'm going to do a checks for collision comment. And I'm going to define a function is collision. And I'm using these words because this function is going to return true if there's a collision and false if there's not. So there are actually 4 parameters here because if you think about it, we want to really measure some sort of distance. The bullet has to come within some sort of distance of the enemy for there to be a collision. So our parameters are enemy X, enemy Y, bullet X, bullet Y, and basically we want to set up a distance function or a distance variable that's going to calculate the distance between the enemy and the bullet. So in order to do this, I have to go back up to the top of my screen and I have to import math because I want to use a square root here, right? We need a distance formula and also squaring numbers, and that's going to make that possible. So the distance, if you remember, is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared, and that's what we're going to set up with our formula. So the function or the method is math.sqrt for square root. And from there, we need to square something. So that function is math.pow. So in this function, I'm going to do the subtraction, and I'm just going to use the enemy first and then the bullet. It doesn't matter which way, but enemy X minus bullet X. So that's actually, I guess we could technically say X1 minus X2 here. And then we also need to say what power we want to use. So the power is just squared, so I'm going to use a 2. And we're going to add to that, so I'm going to copy this over. Math pow, enemy Y, bullet Y, and we are still squaring. So just checking, I need to close the parentheses on my pow function. I do have that, but I also, I also need to close the parentheses on my square root function. So I have the 2 parentheses down here. So just being careful there. Now, basically, we could pick any sort of distance. If you think about the fact that these images have some sort of width, it works out pretty well to set the distance to be less than 27 to check if it hits. So if distance is less than 27, basically we want to return true. So that's going to be called in our while loop. And if we return true, we're going to have something that happens. Basically, we're going to update score. We have to think about what happens to the bullet and what happens to the enemy when it's hit. So if distance is less than 27, we are going to return true. Else, right, if it's not less than 27, we're going to return false. So that's the setup for our function. Now we're going to head down into the while loop. And we're going to check for this. We could really check for it anywhere, but I'm going to check for it kind of in that section where we're checking boundaries and just checking different things. So right underneath my bullet state checking, I'm going to do this part. So we're indented because we're in the while loop. So we are going to do first call our function to check for the collision, and I'm using a variable called collision equal to is collision, and I'm just using my same variable, so I don't feel like writing this again, so we're going to go back up, and I'm just going to kind of copy this code here. Go back down. So sorry if this makes you dizzy. Back up and down. So I just copied the parameters because I'm using the same ones, okay, for this. So now remember, collision, this variable, is set either equal to either true or false depending on if there was a collision or not. So underneath this, I'm going to type if collision, which basically means if collision is true. basically we're going to send the bullet back to its starting spot. So remember, the bullet isn't really visible when it's in its starting spot, but we do want to send the bullet Y back to 275. Okay, so it's going to be down by the player then. And we also want to set the bullet state back to ready. So if you remember, when it's firing, it's running and it's moving up, but now it's going back to ready, so it's just staying in position. Other things we want to do, we are going to go back up and set a score variable. So I need to do that outside of the while loop. So going back up here, I'm just going to throw that right in above the game loop. Could really put it in any number of spaces, but it kind of makes sense logically to look at it here. So I'm going to set the score equal to 0. So it's starting out at 0, and we're basically going to show that score. So go back down. Once the score is set, we're back in this collision section. So we sent the bullet back and put it ready. We're going to set our score. Remember, we can do this plus equals 1. This is equivalent to score equals score plus 1. But as you start to get used to this more, anytime you want to add something to a current value, you can use this plus equals 1. Then I want to print the score, and for right now I'm just going to print it at the bottom of the screen, kind of in that white space over here, okay, versus putting it on the screen somewhere. We'll do that later. Now, the other thing I need to do is once the enemy gets hit in here, I want to kind of send it back into its loop back and forth so that it can be hit again. So I'm going to copy that code. I'm going to move up to the enemy setup. Okay, so I'm going to copy these 2 lines, and that's going to give the enemy a new starting spot. Indent. So there's a lot going on here, right? Send the bullet back, send the enemy back up to the top in a random spot, and then update my score. So we're going to try this now, see how it works. So when I ran mine, I got an error code. If you see if distance is less than 27, I have an unexpected indent. There was no reason to indent any of these lines because I'm not in a different if statement or anything like that. So I'm just backing everything up here in my function, and then I'll run it again. Here's my game running. I'm going to click on here and press the bullet. So I missed the first time, right? Nobody moved. Hopefully I'm better this time. So we'll push it here, and I miss again. And if you see it, it was kind of hard to see. I'm going to try to do it again. Do you see how it's hitting the spaceship? It was so close the other time that you couldn't see it. So each time it hits, the spaceship finds a new location. And then the other thing you want to notice is on the bottom of the screen, the score is being updated. Okay. Now our next video, right, and I'm just sending some extra bullets out to see how when it doesn't hit, it keeps it going, right? That's something I definitely want to test, that I didn't somehow set it for each bullet. Okay, we could change the speed. I think it has a lot to do with my web browser, that the spaceship is, or the enemy is moving so slow. And then also, if we think about this, this isn't super hard or interesting, right? So one thing we can do is change the speed. Here it's completely frozen. And another thing I could do is add extra enemies. So the nice thing about extra enemies is we'll get to use some of our other skills we've learned, because if you have multiple enemies, you probably want to put them in a list.